And what all of these realities, both then and now, teach us is something we know. Not only must we deal with climate reality as we move through this work, we must deal with the climate reality among activists. And one of the climate realities we have to shift is the isolation and the siloism that too often happens. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign is trying to help folks. So we're not an organization. We have enough organization. We're a movement. We're a campaign. We are saying we're an organism. We're saying, look, at some point we got to be clear. You cannot address climate issues unless you address systemic racism and voter suppression, because you can't move the political people who are blocking the kind of legislation that we need. You can't. We have to understand the same people that are against living wages, that are against gay community, that are against public education, that are against voting rights, that are the same people that are against climate justice.
You've also called the modern Republican Party the most dangerous organization in human history. Why do you say that?
They're the only organization in human history that is dedicated with passion to ensuring that human survival of organized human society will be impossible. That's exactly their program since 2009, when they shifted to a denialist position under the impact of the Koch brothers juggernaut. Before that, when McCain was running, there was a moderate, limited climate program. Since then, denialism. There's nothing like that in human history. It's clear what's going to happen. We don't have much time.
Yeah, they're the only mainstream conservative party in the Western world that denies climate science. You're right to highlight that. Let me ask you this. You're 92 years young. You've been writing about, commenting on politics for over 60 years now. Dare I ask, over the course of your life and career, what are you most proud of in terms of positions you took, and what is your biggest regret? What did you get wrong?
The biggest regret is not doing enough and not doing it early enough. There are things that have been achieved to which I'm happy to have made some contribution. The most gratifying thing is the work of the young activists, people like Sunrise Movement, who I just mentioned, many others, who are carrying things forward in the face of severe difficulties, unflinching, and moving forward on crucial challenges. That's gratifying.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The progressive left can be masterfully self-destructive. Various factions often insist that their version of leftist truth is the only and purest version. They weaken and divide progressive causes and turn off many people who otherwise might be open to movements that could make major progressive differences in their lives. Nowhere have we seen these debates occurring more bitterly and unnecessarily than the ones pitting spiritual versus political radicals. We have two guests on the Radical Imagination today who understand the absurdity of that narrowness and the need to have historic and open dialogue. The Poor People's Campaign, with our guest, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, as one of its strategic moral leaders, calls out the false moral narratives of racial and religious nationalism, challenges the concept of a slaveholder's religion, preaches for a transformative revolution of values and a moral revival that's necessary to save the heart and soul of our democracy. It's not about left and right, Democrat or Republican, but about right and wrong. Our other guest, Noam Chomsky, argues for a principle of universality, a moral and intellectual imperative which says that at the very least, we should apply to ourselves the same standards that we apply to others. In terms of government, that means we should apply the same ethical and moral principles we apply to other governments to our own. Chomsky and Hartgrove, using different vocabularies, are talking the same language. Webs of falsehoods and the truths they obscure need to be broken so that people can choose not to live in a world of comforting illusion. Noam Chomsky is one of the most cited scholars alive, a defining Western intellectual figure whose early childhood political activism was rooted in a Jewish immigrant working class tradition. He helped spark the cognitive revolution in the human sciences, and as one of the world's preeminent political dissenters, remains the leading critic of U.S. foreign policy, neoliberalism, contemporary state capitalism, and mainstream corporate news media. His ideas are highly influential in anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movements around the world, where he's seen as a genuine people's hero, an inspiration for struggles all over the world for freedom. Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is a Christian writer, preacher, and moral activist who writes about racism and the central importance of racial reconciliation in Christianity. He identifies with the new monasticism movement and has been a key leader, friend, and strategist with the Reverend William Barber through Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. He's co-authored numerous articles and sermons with Reverend Barber, including their major work, The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement. Jonathan's latest book is Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. So, Jonathan and Noam, thank you so very, very much for being here. This is really a wonderful, this is a historic, a very necessary dialogue. And I'm just so pleased that you both are here. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for bringing us together. This is a wonderful gift for me.
It really is. It's a gift for all of us. It really, really is. And you know, let's just really dive in here. I found a wonderful little short statement that Noam made just recently in an interview we had relating to the Poor People's Campaign. And this is what he said, talking about the various social issues that we're all facing. All of these things ought to be brought together. I'm sure you recall that Martin Luther King Jr., at the end of his life, at the point where he was sharply losing liberal support, was trying to organize a Poor People's Campaign. Black and white, wherever you're from, you're poor, struggling, working people. That's our campaign. That's what ought to be done. All of these concerns interact. They're integrated. They all ought to be dealt with. You can understand why for some people, some of them are more important than others, but it's a matter of bringing them all together because they're basically all on the same side. Now, that's a profound statement. Noam, could you comment on that a little bit? And then Jonathan, respond to what Noam was saying here. Do you feel, as you look at the present day Poor People's Campaign, the needs are still the same, or how are we doing as you perceive that movement?
There are many obstacles. There are many divisions which shouldn't exist among people who have basically the same objectives, basically the same needs, are caught in various, as we said before, dangerous illusions which separate them from one another when they should be cooperating. We see this on issue after issue. We're in the midst of a severe health crisis. Take medical care. We cannot overlook the fact that the United States is one of the very rare countries that does not have a universal commitment to health care for everyone. Overwhelmingly popular There, back in the Reagan years, 70% of the population thought that universal health care should be a constitutionally guaranteed right. Almost every country has it. We all need it. We're battling about it. Republican Party has tried desperately to prevent even the slight moves towards better medical care and the Affordable Care Act, offering no alternative. People are embattled over the issue when they should be committed to working together to carry it forward. And this is true on issue after issue. I should say that we might think about some of the basic facts of the matter. So, for example, the RAND Corporation, highly regarded research organization, it recently published a study of the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, the middle class, the working class, the transfer of wealth from them to the top tiny fraction of the population, mostly a fraction of 1%, during the last 40 years. Their estimate is close to $50 trillion. That's all of us, almost all of us, 90% of the population. In fact, it's much higher because even above the 90%, they're not getting it. It's going to the very top because of public policies which are not graven in stone. They're not laws of economics. They're political decisions made by political leaders. We should all be opposed to this major assault on the general population and should be working in concert to reverse it and overcome it instead of fighting battles over artificial divisions, which are imposed on us very often by leadership and propaganda. We should be in this battle. This is only one of them together. I'll just mention one more, which is an existential crisis. We are facing the threat of environmental catastrophe. The human species is facing problems that have never arisen in the hundreds of thousands of years of human history. We cannot avoid it. It's coming. You can't prevent the melting of the Arctic ice caps by just wishing it away. You can't wish away the fact that temperatures in Siberia are reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit, melting the permafrost. Nobody knows the impact. Cannot overlook the fact that the Arctic ice caps contain enough water to raise sea levels by maybe 40 feet or so. That's happening. We must get together, unify in dedicating ourselves to overcoming this crisis. The solution is known. There are measures that are feasible, that are known, can overcome it, but there can't be any delay in joining together in this country, all over the world, to undertaking the actions which must and can be taken to ensure that human society can survive, can move on to a better world.
Yeah.
Oh,
Jonathan.
that's so true.
Yeah.
That is so true. And I appreciate how you began by saying that the illusions that are used to divide the great majority are the obstacle we face in terms of meeting these challenges. You're absolutely right. It's not that we don't have any resources to address these things. It's not that we don't have the policies and solutions that could make real progress. It's that we have not been able to build the kind of coalition in this country because we have been so divided. And with the Poor People's Campaign and our efforts to do what we call moral fusion organizing, what we've been trying to do is to bring the people together who have been intentionally divided. This Republican Party that is essentially an obstructionist element within our government to prevent these common sense ways that we could address the real challenges of our time. The way they have divided us has been through, for 40 years, culture wars and voter suppression. And that voter suppression has been very surgical and very quiet at the state level for quite some time. But right this summer, we are facing the real reality that, every Republican in the Senate went on the record just a couple weeks ago to say that they will not even debate federal protections for voting rights, and are making the same states' rights arguments against that were used by the Southern senators before the Civil War, and again by the Southern senators during the Civil Rights era. And so we think that it's a critical time to bring people together and say that the future of the planet, the future of the well-being of people on all the issues that you were talking about, and the future of democracy is at stake. And that this is the time to build power for a coalition of poor and low-wage working people who represent the vast majority of this country, and who I think see that on issues of healthcare, of living wages, of addressing the climate crisis, and of redirecting money from endless wars to programs that genuinely uplift people are key priorities that lift us all. So I deeply appreciate your analysis. It's right along the lines of what we have been hearing from communities all around the country, and it's where we see people coming together to really build power. I think the other thing I would bring up is that the key question in terms of organizing is, can people believe that change is possible, right? For so long, so many people have seen this two-party system that so legitimates the kind of lies. I mean, we talk about the big lie now in terms of the stolen election, but the really big lie that you pointed to when you were speaking earlier, Professor Chomsky, is this lie that the Republican Party has backed for decades now, that climate change isn't real, and they've legitimated that, and for so long in most of the media sphere and public conversation, made a legitimate position within our political discourse to deny the reality of what was happening right in front of our faces. And of course, that was all sponsored by oil and the big corporations that have also sponsored the culture wars. And that's where I, as a preacher, am so concerned about the way that the Christian community that I'm part of has been manipulated and divided by these culture wars for so long. And we have forgotten the basic commitment to truth and to reality that's at the heart of our scriptures. And so recovering that and reclaiming the moral imperative that we love our neighbor as ourselves, that we tell the truth, that, these basic things that doesn't matter what tradition you're in, mama and daddy in the community teach you these things when you're young, and yet we have thrown these things to the side and gotten all caught up in these culture wars that the oil companies paid for us to fight.
Couldn't agree more. I must say that what's happening sometimes reminds me of my childhood, the 1930s. There was a major fascist general, one of General Franco's leading companions, General Austria, whose slogan was "Abajo la inteligencia, viva la muerte," down with intelligence, viva death. Sometimes I think we're moving in that direction.
But Noam, as you've pointed out, writings of David Hume, for example, power is always in the hands of the people who are oppressed. So how come we have so submitted ourselves to illegitimate authority. You've done all kinds of research and work on this, the manufacturing of consent. How has the propaganda model, how has the public relations industry turned our natural goodness, if you will, upside down?
Well, remember David Hume's response. He said it was amazing to see the easiness with which the great majority who have the power nevertheless submit themselves to the governors. And when he asks himself how this miracle is accomplished, said the only possible answer is consent. They are manipulated into the belief that this is the way things must be. They're told there is no option to your being subordinated to power. That's what many centuries later Antonio Gramsci called hegemonic common sense. It's drilled into your head that this is the way things must be. It's like the air you breathe. You can't question it. It's when people like Martin Luther King, who you brought up, great figure, others, people on the ground whose names are unknown, who were working on it hard. It's when they tell you, inform you, instruct you, help you discover it's not true. You can take your fate into your own hands. You don't have to submit to authority. You have the power. You can change the world. That's when we get changes. When going back 60 years, when SNCC workers were riding in freedom buses through Alabama, trying to encourage Black farmers to take the great risk of registering to vote. They were telling people, you don't have to submit to this. It's bitter, it's dangerous, but you can take your lives into your own hands. It's an everlasting battle. It's going on right now, but there have been breakthroughs. There's been progress. There's regression sometimes. You have to keep fighting. That's the way you overcome the easiness by which the majority who have the power submit to the few.
And I think that is a wisdom that so many people on the ground in their communities have. What often doesn't happen is it doesn't get lifted up into our national discourse. And that's why I think we need campaigns to bring us together, to lift up the stories of people who are refusing to submit to this, common sense that is neither very sensical nor very common in terms of helping common people. It really is the logic of the corporate elite, but it's been impressed upon people, and they're told that there's no alternative in Washington. It's why I'm so encouraged that after 3 years of organizing, we have been able to introduce a House resolution for the Third Reconstruction that lays out a whole omnibus plan of policies that could make a real difference on all the issues that we've been talking about. And the Poor People's Campaign has worked with economists to develop budgets that show how we could pay for it. We've worked with policy folks to say that, there's not any one piece of legislation that's going to make this happen, but there are dozens of pieces of legislation and executive actions that could be taken that could change even the conversation about what we think is possible in our common life. And why are we not able to do that? Because we don't have representatives at this point that are willing to push that forward. We don't have a majority of representatives, but we do have some. And introducing it in the House means that people have to go on the record now. And I think we are going to continue to build power to demonstrate that people who have often thought that it doesn't make any difference to vote can see that if they come together with other people who are impacted by these issues, that we are the majority and that we can change this, but it's going to take fighting. And so, like Mother Jones said, we fight like hell until hell freezes over, and then we fight on the ice. I mean, it's this kind of determination of people who live with their backs against the wall and know that they have no choice but to fight that really is driving this campaign. And I'm encouraged by every community I spend time with, whether they're fighting for their kids not to have to drink leaded water, or they're fighting for their families not to be deported down on the border. It's communities like that demonstrate to me that there is a capacity for this kind of fight. We've just got to come together, and we've got to keep the pressure on. This needs to be certainly a summer of keeping the pressure on in DC, because voting rights are crucial, as are these conversations about the budget and infrastructure. We have the possibility to do things that really could make a difference on climate change, that really could make a difference on the future of the democracy. But we don't currently have the will of a political majority to do it. We've got to create that, and we do it by insisting that it doesn't have to be this way.
Moral fusion how is that operating? You're talking to us from North Carolina, right? You're dealing with deep-rooted, deep-seated racial antagonisms, and yet you're trying to bridge the gap and show the legitimacy of the common fight that antagonistic groups have. How are you meeting that struggle? Are you getting a lot of pushback? Are you getting people to see your point?
Well, I'm in Stokes County, North Carolina today. This is the county where I grew up, and it's an overwhelmingly red county on political maps. It's a county where anywhere you go these days, you see Trump flags. But we have organized here with the Poor People's Campaign, and we done that by listening to people here who were concerned about the health impacts on the community of coal ash, which is dumped by the local power company into these surface ponds, where it seeps, the heavy metals seep into the water, and there's incredibly high rates of cancer in this area. And so joining with those folks, listening to their concerns, trying to see what can be done to address that specific issue at the state level and at the federal level with EPA, we've also begun to make the political argument that the people who represent these folks in the State House and in the Congress are, of course, sponsored by the Duke Energy Corporation that owns the coal power plant, and have been going along with their narrative, even though these people know that it's killing them. And those are the same people that are trying to make it more difficult to vote in this state. And we've just asked people to pay attention that the same people that don't want everyone to vote are the people who won't support corporate accountability for coal ash ponds. They also won't support living wages. They won't support health care. And at the state level here, this is a state that refused to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Well, that's a very specific number. You can talk to, there's 500,000 people in this state who don't have health care coverage simply because the representatives in the state would not accept the federal program that would provide it to people. And so on issues like that, we've tried to be very practical about how a coalition that is impacted maybe in different ways, maybe not everybody has coal ash in their water is struggling to make a living wage. But when you meet the people who can't earn a living wage, when you meet the people who don't have access to healthcare, and you realize that you all have a common enemy in the representatives who are really working for the corporations, then there's an opportunity to come together and say, let's build a coalition. That's what we call a fusion coalition. Let's build power, and let's refuse to be divided by these propaganda campaigns that they continue to push that are simply designed to pit us against one another. This was the great insight that Dr. King had, and had it from, I think, the Southern Freedom Movement that has been paying attention to the tactics of the plantation economy for centuries now, when he said that the whole history of the South has been pitting poor black folks against poor white folks so that they would not join together and vote and work for a society that served most people, as opposed to the plantation class, which is that, you know, 10th of the 1% that that you mentioned earlier, towards which the wealth of so many has been transferred steadily since the mid 20th century.
So and Noam, you've written so long about this vicious class struggle that Jonathan is also talking about. So this doesn't surprise you, does it? The pushback and some of the things that the economic elites are planning on doing and are doing to further divide and conquer.
There is in this country a largely one-sided class struggle. The corporate class, the class that basically owns the economy, the overwhelming mass of it, they are dedicated, unified, constantly fighting a battle to ensure that they maintain their power. And one of the methods of doing it is dividing the opposition, dividing the overwhelming majority into groups that fight each other instead of joining to fight for their common interests. So yes, that comment of Dr. King's about setting poor black people against poor white people instead of having them join together in their common interests, of course, that's a technique for ensuring that the great mass don't arise, join in the struggle, and overthrow our power. Obvious mechanism, but it can be overcome. The technique that Jonathan just described of finding common interests in finding a common ground, opposing cancer-creating chemical enterprises. That's a starting point, and that's being done elsewhere. It's been done actually all through history. The great labor movement of the 19th century, Knights of Labor, began by organizing in black workers in Louisiana. It was a biracial movement. Blacks and whites were working together to overcome the horrendous conditions of the early industrial society. There were efforts to separate them, break them apart, but they often did join together in common enterprises. Goes right through history. Black-white antagonisms were overcome during the period of CIO organizing in the 1930s, which is what led to the New Deal measures that we all benefit from and that the rich and powerful have been trying to dismantle for the last 40 years. It's going on right now. The campaign in North Carolina is duplicated in many ways in the main coal mining states. In West Virginia, the head of the Mine Workers Union, with the support of miners, has recently indicated support for a transitional program that will end the use of coal and help the miners whose lives and communities depend on that transition to better jobs, better community, capping coal mines, working to develop sustainable energy. 19 unions in California, oil-based state, have recently agreed to a similar set of proposals. These are very significant breakthroughs. The groups that the corporate sector that the Trump administration particularly have been trying to foster in their race to destruction are finally coming together to say, we can end this race to destruction. We can join in creating a better world based on sustainable energy, better communities, better jobs, better lives. We can do that. It can be done. It takes a lot of work on the ground. This did not come out of nowhere. It came from dedicated activism. One of the leading figures in this is friend and co-author Robert Cullen, who's done the most extensive scholarly work on how to transition to a new economy, but is also an activist, constantly working on the ground with union members, community groups, to get them to join in working on these issues, which not only can greatly improve their lives, but can save all of us. That can be done. It's not easy, but it's possible, and you're showing it.
Let me ask you, Jonathan, as well. 1968, the Poor People's Campaign. Martin Luther King also saw this campaign as a universal one, correct? Universal human right. So where does the international community come into your movement and the connections that you're trying to make with it? What role can they play in furthering what Noam is talking about here? It's crucial, isn't it? Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. The people's movements around the world that are rising up to essentially, demand the same basic human rights, I think are incredibly important. We were invited, Bishop Barber and a delegation went to the Vatican a couple of years ago, invited by the current Pope to be part of a Poor People's Assembly. And the portion of the Pope's most recent encyclical that really addresses the moral demands that any economy must address are largely quotations from the piece that he wrote for that assembly, and in many ways reflect the wisdom of these poor people's movements around the world. So yes, I think we're both inspired by movements that are happening in other places and consider ourselves very much a part of them. I think the nature of the economic exploitation that we're fighting is global, and so any struggle to overcome it must also be global. And I think we have a lot to learn from the tactics and strategies that have been developed in different places.
Right. Noam, if I could for a few minutes to go back to your childhood, your activism, and some of the things you were reading and influenced, and I was interested in looking a little bit at the left Zionist writings of Ahad Haham that you have mentioned, very much influenced your thinking. And one of the things that I've picked up from his writing is that he wanted a Jewish state and not merely a state of Jews, a spiritual center. Isn't that what we're talking about here? So from your own background, doesn't this translate into some of the things you're also talking about, and Jonathan's talking about, making this a universal liberation for people? Isn't that what you are also picking up there in your own Jewish immigrant working class tradition?
Well, there are many threads that intertwine my own personal life, but generally. So Ahad Haham, who I was reading when I was a child in Hebrew with my father. When I was 10 or 11 years old, he was in the early stages of the Zionist movement. He was one of the few who recognized there is a Palestinian population. They live here, they have rights. We have to be part of the society in which their rights are protected and prioritized. He was one of the very few who insisted on that. His own goal was for a spiritual center, which would be in Palestine, which would reinvigorate the life of the diaspora by its moral leadership, cultural leadership. That was an image of the 1920s, 1930s. By the time I was a young political activist in the 40s, it had moved on to an effort to create a binational society based on Arab-Jewish working class cooperation for a kind of a cooperative commonwealth. That vision didn't succeed, but it hasn't died either. And it universalizes. We have to recognize that the situation we are now in is one where we basically have two choices. It's either internationalism, international cooperation and solidarity, or a race to extinction. Those are the choices. We don't have any other. The problems we face have no borders. There are no borders to the pandemic. If we continue with this cruel and savage policy of monopolizing vaccines for the rich and denying them to the great mass of humanity who need them in Latin America, Asia, Africa, we continue with that. Not only is it ethically outrageous, it is also suicidal. All leaders who are pursuing this savage policy understand very well that by allowing the virus to mutate, strains will develop, which will sooner or later come back to us, maybe be uncontrollable. Maybe we'll get to something like the hideous pandemic of 1918, shortly before I was born, which killed maybe 500 million people, 50 million people. Well, we might get to that. It's an international problem. With global warming, it's even more obvious. Temperature's 120 in Siberia. It's going to affect us too. In fact, it is right now. There are no borders. We have to work together, not just overcoming our own internal antagonisms, but jointly with others. We're going to have to work together cooperatively with the second most powerful society in the world, way behind us, but growing, China. Have to work together with them cooperatively to overcome common problems. It's shocking to see that in order to pass a bill that would bring Republicans and Democrats together, a bill to rebuild bridges, prevent things from like the Miami tragedy, in order to reconstruct decaying infrastructure in the United States, it had to be put in a hate China framework in order to bring Republicans on board to be willing to vote for it, even something that we desperately need. I should say this is bipartisan insanity to try to build antagonism, controversy, conflict, where we have to move towards negotiation, diplomacy, and cooperation. It can be done. Doesn't mean you overlook abuses and crimes, of course not. But the overwhelming responsibility and imperative is to work together to overcome existential crises that have no borders.
Is this a similar conversation that you've been having within the Christian world too, Jonathan? As a spiritual progressive, is this a sort of, as I say, discussion that's also occurring within that world?
Well, there's certainly a recognition that faith has been intentionally manipulated in order to fuel a kind of nationalism that allows for the kind of corporate program that we've been talking about to be framed. This is the most bizarre sort of linguistic thing in the world, but it's framed as populism. It baffles me all the time, but it's certainly the way it's presented, right? And so a lot of what we have been doing, the Poor People's Campaign is certainly made up of people who are deeply rooted in faith communities and people who are not. But one of the things we've been doing within the campaign is saying that, you know, on so many of these issues, we really have to reframe the conversation and insist as the people that what is happening in DC is not compromise but capitulation. You know, it was incredibly important to organize people from Joe Manchin's West Virginia to be in Washington, D.C. just a couple of weeks ago, when he, you know, as someone who has advocated so loudly for bipartisanship and for the need for compromise and for, you know, the Senate rules that are supposed to encourage that, when he put forward his memo of the kind of you know, capitulation to the you know, insanity about the big lie and these voter suppression measures, you know, maybe we'll give them a little voter ID, maybe we'll give them a little of this. He put this forward and he couldn't get a single Republican to even get on board with that. And so it was very important to have people from his home state of West Virginia, where the For the People Act has over 70% approval, to be there and to say, no, you're not representing us. You know, you're saying that you're compromising, that you're appealing to this common sense, that you're representing the average West Virginian, the Middle American, whatever the image is that's cast. But as a matter of fact, this is extremism, and it's capitulation to extremism for anyone to say that we're going to, you know, have some sort of compromise that gives a little to the other side in order to get from this side. It's a critical moment, I think, for those people who organized and did make real political gains, in particular in the Senate in places like Georgia last year, to step forward and say, we demand of all of our elected representatives that they represent what the majority of the people want. And the very base level of that in the current moment has to be a recognition that everyone in this country has a right to vote, and that vote cannot be denied or abridged. That's in the Constitution. And every bill that has been pushed through dozens of legislatures around the country this year has been explicitly an attempt to abridge the vote that that was overwhelmingly for change and transformation in the last election. Right. So this is not a form of populism. This is really a form of authoritarianism, as you would point out, right, Noam? And just in the few minutes we have left, perhaps, Noam, you'd like to comment and just give us some final words on your thoughts about the Poor People's Movement and what you think about it and what you would hope it could accomplish, and what are some of the continued strategies it might be involved in to make a real difference.
Well, I think the Poor People's Movement in 1968 was, I think, Martin Luther King's greatest contribution. It was beaten back by Northern liberals. Of course, the South was opposed to it, but Northern liberals were too, as Martin Luther King moved to the north, as long as he was condemning racist Alabama sheriffs, he had a pretty good image in the Northern liberal community. When he moved to the North, began to confront racism in the North, class oppression in the North, his popularity sharply declined. Also, when he began condemning the Vietnam War, which was virtually wiping out Vietnam at that point, when he began to condemn that, he also lost Northern liberal popularity. His popularity when he was assassinated, of course, when he was trying to support actions by sanitation workers, the lowest of the low. And, the Poor People's Movement did not die when he was killed. His widow, Coretta King, continued with the plans. They marched to Washington, going through the areas of the South that had been the major points of confrontations, bitter, brutal ones, victories, on to Washington, where they set up Restoration City. They were pleading with the most liberal Congress in American history to take up legislation which would deal with fundamental problems that face the Black and white population in the United States.
And forgive me, just because we only have a minute to go. And the present day Poor People's Campaign, do you see them understanding that history?
It is picking that up.
Yeah,
It should be picking up that legacy, moving forward with it, and our new circumstances, and it's the path to survival.
right. Jonathan and Noam, I really want to thank both of you so very, very much for starting this important dialogue, and it is a historic one, and it's just been, I think, so enlightening for our audience. Again, I want to thank you so very, very much, both of you. I heard a couple of dog barks there, Noam. I don't know if your dog is saying we want to go out.
Don't say that word. If that word is said, there'll be a race to the door.
There'll be a race to a door. All right.
Very careful about the word.
Why don't we do that? And again, peace and love. Thank you so very much. And we'll carry on, and we'll turn this around. Thank you again so much, Noam. Thank you, Jonathan, so very, very much.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you. And thank you all for so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.